Okay, so we've covered a little bit on JWTs, and now let's start thinking about how we're actually going to use them. First of all, in this JWT file, we declared a secret key here. We're going to need one of those in our application also. But we no longer need this file, so let's actually just go ahead and get rid of it. We're going to need to include the secret key in our environment variables again. But first, getting rid of the JWT key. Beautiful, and we're good to go. So let's add that secret key here. We'll say secret key equals, and for the moment, I'm just gonna put something super duper super secret. And it doesn't really matter what that is for the time being, since we're gonna want to set a serious one later on, but that's what we'll keep it as for now. And in the .env template, let's say secret key equals change me, just so that we remember that we need to change that. And we're also going to want to update our config to export that secret key as well. So let's extract it. We'll say const secret key equals process.env.secret key, or we'll just put secret dev here. And when we're in dev, it doesn't really matter. And then let's also make sure to print it out to the screen. Secret key. And export it as well. So now it's made available to the rest of our application, which is exactly what we want. And again, remember to keep this secret out of Git. This is why we are putting it in the .env file, because we do not want anyone to have the secret key. Now, with that, having said that, and having the config set up, it is time to create some utility functions for managing JWTs. And so in the utils directory, I'm going to touch a new file, utils. I'm going to call it tokens.js. And it is going to store all of our token-related util functions. And it's really actually just going to be a modification of the functions we defined a few seconds ago. So we're just going to say const jwt equals require JSON web token, if we can spell that right. Then we're going to import the secret key we just created from config. We're also going to create the generate token function, jwt.sign the data with the secret key. Now, the configuration here actually defaults to the HS256 algorithm anyway, so we don't need to worry about it. However, for expires in, we probably don't want it to expire in 10 seconds like we had before. For the moment, we're going to set it to 24 hours, though, again, there are certain security concerns that you have to think about when determining when your tokens expire, but we'll get into that at a much later date. Next up, let's create a validate token function. And this one, again, is going to look very similar to the other one, except I want to actually try catch it in case there is an error or in case there's some kind of issue. We just want to return nothing. So we'll say const decoded equals jwt.verify the token and the secret key, and we'll return the decoded token. Now, if there is an error, which is totally possible, we'll catch that error, and we'll just return an empty object. Make it easy on ourselves. And let's module.exports equals generate token, validate token. Great. Let's actually, you know what? Let's create one more up here, and we'll just call this create token for you. No, let's just call it create user JWT. And it just takes in a user, and we'll make them. Actually, let's create the payload here. Let's say const payload, and let's say email is the user.email. And then let's also say, let's just set the isAdmin status as well. So in case they're an admin, we'll know that. Otherwise, we'll just default it to false. And then let's return generate token with the payload. Then we'll save this, and let's make sure we export that as well. So 3 utility functions, super useful. One to generate tokens, one to validate them, just as before in our JWT file. And on top of that, a create user JWT function to accept a user object and then convert it into a valid token, storing only the email and isAdmin values. And this is going to prove super useful when combined with custom authentication middleware, which we're going to write up in a second and then explain them all. So let's create a new directory called middleware. And this is going to be fun because we're going to talk a lot more about middleware in a second. And then let's create a new file in it called middleware. security.js. And you can guess what that one is going to handle. It is going to handle security. Now, we're going to write a ton of code here. And when we do write this code, I'm going to explain very little of it. I'm going to go over it pretty briefly. And then I'm going to stop and I'm going to kind of go back and explain it as best I can. But it's really not going to make a ton of sense until we actually use it and you see it in action. Either way, let's get to business. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to acquire the JSON web token package. We're going to import that secret key. Const secret key equals require, oops, I cannot type, /config. And let's import the unauthorized error from, oops, equals, I was typing what I was saying instead of actually typing what I needed to, errors, the errors file. Now, we're going to do a few things here. The first is we're going to create a function to extract the Jwt from the request header. Then we're going to create a function to attach the user to the response object. Then we're going to create a function to verify a auth user exists. 3 functions. Here's what they do. 2 of them are going to be middleware, which we'll explain in a second. So first, I'm going to call this one const Jwt from equals headers. It's just going to take in the request object, and we're just destructuring the headers from the request object. Then it's going to say if headers dot authorization. Now I'm using this optional chaining parameter here in case this is an invalid request object, though that probably shouldn't happen, but just to be sure. If headers.authorization exists, let's take that headers.authorization and let's split it like this. Now, the reason why is because the authorization header we expect to look like this. Bearer, whatever the JWT token is. And so this string is what we're splitting here, and we're splitting it at that space. So this first part here is the scheme, and the second part is the token itself. So we're going to say scheme token. And again, we're destructuring out the array of when we split this authorization header. Now, if this scheme.trim is equal to bearer, so if it is a bearer, this is just generally the prefix we use for JWT tokens in our case. If it's the correct prefix, then we will return whatever that token is there. And if any of this goes wrong, we just return undefined. Return nothing. Then we're going to use that function. And this one is going to be a lot more interesting. A lot less complicated, but a lot more interesting. We'll call this extract user from JWT. And this is going to look like your traditional middleware. It's going to take in the request object, the response object, and the next function. We're going to run a try-catch block. And if anything goes wrong, we're going to return next, because we don't care. We'll just pass on to the next middleware in the chain. Otherwise, if things are all good, we'll say const token equals JWT from the request. So we're passing this request object into this JWT from function. And if everything goes well, it'll return that token. Now, if that token exists, if it was if it was actually exist in the authorization header, then we'll take it and we'll say, hey, res.locals.user is equal to jwt.verify the token with the secret key. So, what's happening here? Well, all we're doing is we're ensuring, hey, is this a valid token? Right? If it is, then we attach it to res.locals.user. Now, why are we doing that? Well, all we're saying is that if we can take this token out of the authorization header and we can verify that it's a valid user using the correct secret key, then we're going to attach it to the response object so that anything else in our middleware chain can access that user on res.locals.user. Then we're just going to call return next. We'll just pass it on, hey, the next handler in this middleware chain, it's on you. And since every middleware gets the request and response object, all those, anything that comes after this will have access to the user on res.locals.user. Then let's also come down here and create our function to verify an auth user exists. We'll say const require authenticated user equals the same thing, rec res next. And we will run a try catch block. And we will return next with the error if anything goes wrong here. Now, this is different than our extract user, because if no user exists in the authorization header, that's fine. We'll just say, cool, doesn't matter, return next. But this function is going to actually verify that an authenticated user exists, and if one doesn't, we want to throw that error. So we want to return next with the error that was thrown here. Oh, I said error instead of error. I should probably just call those all error. Sometimes I just like to type short and be lazy, but I probably shouldn't. Now, the thing we're going to check is we're going to say, hey, this user needs to exist on res.locals. If that user doesn't exist and or the user.email does not exist, then we're going to throw a new unauthorized error. And if everything goes well, we just return next. So these are both pretty simple, but they all kind of depend on each other. And they're all related. And again, covering them from the bottom up, the Jwt function is passed. Well, actually, let's cover them from the bottom. Sorry, I said bottom up and then I went top up. Bottom up, this required authenticated user expects a user to be attached to res.locals. If that user exists and they have a valid email, then this will not happen and it'll just return next and go to the next function. If there is no user, or if the user does not have a valid email, then we throw an unauthorized error and they aren't allowed to continue. It just goes to the next with the error and it'll be passed to our generic error handler. The other thing we have to think about here is this extract user from Jwt function. Now, this function depends on the extract user from Jwt function working. It depends on it. The reason why is because this is the function that will attach the user to the res.locals object that the require authenticated user function is extracting here. If it didn't do that, then this will throw an error. So we need to make sure that this function runs before this one. Now, this function, the extract user from Jwt function, takes in the request and the response, and it calls the Jwt from function on that request object, extracts the headers, gets the scheme of the token, and returns the token if it exists. Otherwise, it returns undefined. Now, there's a ton of stuff happening here, and it might not all make sense to you, because especially since we haven't gone over middleware that much, but it'll make a lot more sense when we actually use it. So let's go ahead and let's take this extract user from Jwt middleware and use it in our server.js middleware pipeline. Let's head into server.js and let's import it. We'll say const security equals require middleware security. And then before our routes, but after the other middleware, we'll say app.use security.extract Oh, did I not export those? Oh, I didn't. Let's do that too. Module.exports equals require authenticated user. We also want to export the extract user from Jwt. And we won't export this one since this is already using it. We'll just export those two functions. And then here we'll say security.extract user from Jwt. Now all this middleware does is it makes sure for every request, check if a user exists or if a token exists in the authorization header. If it does, attach the decoded user to res.locals. And that is really all it is doing. Now, again, this whole middleware pipeline and everything else that happens here, like without really if you don't really understand that, a lot of this is going to be hard to grasp conceptually. So it might be a good time to discuss the concept of middleware and Express and go over what the pipeline looks like. But for now, we've done enough work that we should probably save our stuff to Git. So we'll say git status. Looks good. Git add. Git commit. Added utils and security middleware for JWTs. Great. And we're ready.